So let's go to Lenin and the Russian Revolution. How did communism come to power in the Soviet Union?
It came to power as a result of stepping into a power vacuum. And the power vacuum was created by the First World War, and it's the effect that it had as a total war, unprecedented pressure placed on a regime that in many ways was a traditional, almost feudal monarchy, only experiencing the beginnings of the modernization that the rest of Europe had undergone. And for this reason, communism comes to power in a place that Marx probably wouldn't have expected, in the wreckage of the Russian Empire. Lenin is absolutely vital to this equation because he's the one who presses the process forward. Ironically, given the claim of communist leaders to having the key to history, just a few months previous, in exile in Switzerland, Lenin had been despairing and had been convinced that he's may not even live to see the advent of that day. But then, when revolution does break out in the Russian Empire in February of 1917, Lenin is absolutely frantic to get back. And when he does get back, as a result of a deal that is negotiated with the German high command, a step that they'll later live very much to regret, he is able to get back and to go into action and to press for nothing less than the seizure of power that brings his Bolshevik faction, the radical wing of the socialist movement, to power and then to build the Soviet Union.
So even he was surprised how effective and how fast the revolution happened.
He was, although I think that he would have agreed that what was necessary was a cataclysm on the scale of the First World War to make this happen. The First World War shatters so many of the certainties of the 19th century that we talked about as a dynamic period with argument between ideologies. It scrambles all sorts of earlier debates. It renegotiates the status of the individual versus an all-powerful state and the claims of the state, because to win or even just to survive in World War I, you need to centralize, and to put everything onto a authoritarian wartime footing in country after country. So Lenin earlier had already articulated the possibility that this might happen by talking about how the entire globe already was connected. And there's a chain of capitalist development that is connecting different countries so that the weakest link in the chain, if it breaks, if it pops open, it might actually inaugurate much bigger processes and start a chain reaction. And that's what he intended to do and has the chance to do in the course of 1917. Incidentally, just to get a sense of the sheer chaos and the human, on an individual human level, what the absence of established authority meant. There's few works of literature that are as powerful as Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago for giving just the whole sweep of contending forces in a power vacuum. It's an amazing testimony to that time and place.
So you said the Bolsheviks saw violence and terror as necessary. So can you just speak to this aspect of because they took power, and so this was a part of the way they saw the world.
Right, and it had antecedents. Even though Lenin and his colleagues are competing amongst each other for the title of most faithful disciple of Marx and most true to the received theory in practice, there's other influences, earlier influences that operate in the Russian context that were not operative, let's say, on the German context. And here you have to step back and think about the nature of Tsarism, which had maintained still into the 20th century, the notion of a divine right to rule, that God had ordained the Tsarist system and its hierarchies, and that to question these was sinful and politically not advisable. And the restrictive nature of Russian society at this point, dominated by the Tsarist establishment. Its harshness, its reactionary nature meant that people who in another context, in another country, might have been reformers, could instead very easily be provoked into becoming revolutionaries. And Lenin is a perfect example of this because his older brother was executed as a result of being in a radical revolutionary movement who was arrested and executed for association with terrorism. And earlier generations of Russian radicals had founded populist groups that would aim to engage in terrorism and resistance against the Tsarist regime. And this included people who called themselves nihilists. And these nihilists were materialists who saw themselves ushering in a new age by absolute rejection of earlier religious traditions and aiming for material answers to the challenges of the day. Among them was Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who wrote what's been called the worst book ever written. It was, in fact, one of Lenin's favorite books. In Russian, it's "Что делать?" In English, it gets translated "What is to be done?" And it's a utopian novel about revolutionaries and how revolutionaries should act with one another in open ways, new ways, non-traditional ways, in order to help usher in the coming revolution. Lenin loved the work and said it had the great merit of showing you how to be a revolutionary. So there's the Marxist influence, and then there's Russian populist nihilist influence, which is also a very live current in Lenin's thinking. And when you add these things together, you get an explosive mix. Because Lenin, as a result and part of this family trauma of his brother, becomes a absolutely irreconcilable enemy of the Tsarist regime and sets about turning himself into what you might call a guided missile for revolution. He turns himself into a machine to produce revolutionary change. And I mean that with little hyperbole. Lenin at one point shared with friends that he loved listening to music, but he tried not to listen to beautiful music like Beethoven because it made him feel gentle. What the revolution demanded was realism, hardness, absolute steely resolve. So Lenin worries even fellow revolutionaries by the intensity of his single-minded focus to revolution. He spends his days thinking about the revolution. He probably dreamt about the revolution. And so 24/7, it's an existence where he's paired off other human elements quite deliberately in order to turn himself into an effective instigator of revolution. So when the opportunity comes in 1917, he's primed and ready for that role.